Evening, everyone. I'm Andrea. I'm hosting week 2 of the mini Bible school this week, and I can see we've got a steady trickle of people joining. So, welcome, good evening. Hope you've had a good day and hope you've had a good week so far. I hope you're really excited for this evening as well, that you're very comfortable. You've got your notepad, your pen, and an ice drink because if this is anything like last week, it's going to be really exciting. So I don't know how many of you were here for last week's mini Bible school, but it was really, really good. And this week we have the pleasure of our very own John Symons, who's going to be taking us through the incredible life of Hudson Taylor. So if you didn't know, this is a three-part series. We're on week 2 of 3. And if you did miss week 1, it is available on YouTube. You can go back and listen to it, but not right now because we've got something really exciting that we're going to do now. So I'm going to hand over to John Symons, and I'm just going to pray for him really quickly before we start, as people are slowly joining. So, Heavenly Father, thank you that we're able to meet together virtually this evening, and we just pray over John. Thank you for the truths and the stories and the things he's going to reveal to us about Hudson Taylor and this incredible man of faith. And I just pray that our eyes and hearts would be open and we'd be really inspired by the things that we're going to hear this evening. So, with that, John, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I just want to say, by the way, that there'll be a time for questions. I can't guarantee I'll be able to answer them all, but I'll have a go. But use the chat function if you'd like to write in any questions, or some of you will know a great deal about Hudson Taylor. You might like to have comments as well, which will be brilliant if you can do that. Okay. Now, look, I feel a kind of burden on me tonight, really. I'll tell you why, because I'm dealing with the life of undoubtedly one of the greatest Christians, in my opinion, certainly, and I'm sure many more, one of the greatest Christians that we've known in this country for the last 200 years. So off we go. Hudson Taylor, the man who believed God. We are this evening looking at the life of one of the greatest missionaries and greatest Christians to have come out of this country, the Yale professor of missions and Oriental history, Kenneth Scott Latourette, and we'll have the next slide now. There's a quote from him there. Hudson Taylor, if measured by the movement he called into being, was one of the greatest missionaries of all time, and certainly, judged by the results of his efforts, one of the 4 or 5 most influential foreigners who came to China in the 19th century for any purpose, religious or secular. The repercussions of his daring faith are actually felt not just in China, but far and wide, affecting political and social as well as spiritual developments. For example, in India, the abolition of the opium trade. And in Africa, through missions, which owe their origins and principles to Hudson Taylor. It's amazing to reflect on how his life and principles have had an ongoing impact, even through till today. So who was this man? Let's look at a very few brief facts so that we've got an idea. By the way, the picture on the right there was a portrait done by his aunt, who was his mother's sister, on the Hudson side. The word Hudson came from his mother's maiden name. Very, very gifted family from Barton in Humber, actually just in North Lincolnshire, I think it is now. There he was. 1832 in May, born and raised in Barnsley, where he grew up. He went to China in September 1854, age 21. He married Maria Dyer in January 1858. That was in a place called Ningbo in China. He founded the China Inland Mission, known as the CIM, in 1865. That was back in Britain. Maria died age 33 in 1870. I didn't include this, but he actually then married another lady, and an absolutely outstanding person called Jenny Faulding. less than 2 years later. The CIM, fulfilling his original vision, went into all 18 provinces of China from the 1876 onwards. By the late 1880s, it was pretty much established in all 18 provinces of China. We'll look at that, of course, in a bit of detail later on. And eventually, he dies, age 73 in 1905. He dies in the province of Hunan in China. So that's a very brief sketch of the dates and some of the major things in his life. I want actually now to do deliberately, I'm going to spend longer on what I call the foundations of an outstanding life. The reason I'm doing this is quite simple. I think if we're honest, most of us are very ordinary people. And when we come across the life of someone like Hudson Taylor, who could have been a very ordinary person, actually, he didn't come from a moneyed family or anything like that. But he became an absolutely outstanding man. And when we look at our lives alongside him, we think, well, what have I got to learn? You know, we're so different. And so what I want to do here is talk about him as a very young man before he even went to China at 21. So the foundations of an outstanding life. First of all, a godly heritage. He came from a very fine Christian family. It was his great-grandfather, actually, James Taylor, who remarkably got converted on his wedding day in a village about 3-4 miles north of Barnsley. His grandfather was a businessman, but a devout Christian. His father was also a businessman, ran a pharmacy in the middle of Barnsley, but he was a very fine evangelist and preacher. His mother was an outstanding woman of prayer, a godly woman. So he had a wonderful godly heritage. It's interesting, he got converted at the age of 17, actually. He had a childhood faith. It was a remarkable home he came from, a Methodist home, by the way. Methodist Church, for some of you who don't know, was more or less like the Pentecostal church of our day. It was a red hot for Jesus type church in those days. He went to work at 15 and he found himself with skeptical people and he couldn't cope with it. And he really went downhill spiritually. And his parents were very concerned about him. And his mother was much in prayer for him. At 17, just casually, he picked up a tract and he went into a room at the back of, I think, the back of the business. And he read it and the Holy Spirit just used that. And he was dramatically converted, born of God. And from that time onwards, his life was transformed. From then on, he grew rapidly. And I want to read this out. The most formative years of his life were actually from 17 to 21. He adopted courses of action from which he never deviated. His great accomplishments stemmed from his thoughts, principles, courses of action between those ages. That's a remarkable thing. Here are some examples. Interestingly, he was a short, rather frail man, and his parents looked at him and thought, he'll never go abroad. He's too frail. Well, you're probably all aware, I mean, in Victorian England, people died of all sorts of things which they don't die of today. Waterborne diseases like cholera, people died of. And obviously TB, many people died of TB and lots of other things. So what he did, he toughened himself up and he used to walk long distances. But above all, he became a soul winner from very soon after his conversion. First of all in Barnsley, but then he felt a call to China very early on. And it was truly a call from God. So we shouldn't ignore we shouldn't ignore genuine calls of God in very young people. That will come up towards the end of this session, actually, when I talk about an 18-year-old who went to China as a missionary. He was called of God, and he prepared himself for China. He knew that medical work was significant and very important, in fact, in China. And so he decided to train as a doctor. He went to Hull, where his aunt, the portrait painter, was married to a doctor, lovely man, a keen Christian, Dr. Hardy, and he went there to Hull, and he devoted himself to studying medicine. And later on, he went to London, and he was at the London Hospital, which some of you might know is in, I think it's Whitechapel Road, Mile End Road, still there today. And that's where he was trained as a doctor. Okay. It was very, very important to Hudson Taylor. The next point, he proved God did indeed answer prayers for practical needs. Hudson Taylor said this. Look, he said, when I go to China, far inland China, I'll have no relatives there, I'll have no friends. I've got to be able to trust God to meet my daily needs. And that's going to start here. I've got to learn and train myself to trust God for my daily needs. So when he was in Hull with his uncle and aunt, he actually deliberately moved out from very comfortable lodgings in their home, and he moved to a very poor part of town called Drainside. I don't know if it's still there today, but he moved to a very poor part of town, and he took a room with some very working class people and lived very frugally. And during that time, this is what he decided to do. He prayed to God, and he thought, Lord, I'm not going to remind Dr. Hardy of when my salary is due. I've got to give rent to my landlady. She needs it. She's a poor lady. But I'm not going to ask Dr. Hardy for my money. I want you to do so. So this is one of his expressions. There are lots of expressions from Hudson Taylor worth remembering. Here is one. Learn to move men through God by prayer alone. And what happened was this. There was a particular weekend where by the weekend he should have been paid. He wasn't. On the Sunday, he went out evangelizing in a very, very poor part of Hull. And he had a half crown, 2 and 6, which of course these days sounds ridiculously small. It's worth a lot then. You could buy a lot with half a crown in those days. And he was about to go home. He came across this extremely poor family. They were emaciated. I think they were Irish. And the man appealed to him. Look, my wife is dying. She needs medicine. She needs food. Please, can you give it? You're a man of God, etc. And he prayed about it, and he just knew he had to give it. And he gave his last money to this man. And he went home, knowing he'd obeyed God, and wondered what was going to happen. Next day, still no money. And they finished work, and in the evening, relaxed. Suddenly, out of the blue, Dr. Hardy said, Taylor, he said, I've forgotten your money. Hudson Taylor absolutely rejoiced, said, thank you, Lord. Thank you, because he had to give, I've forgotten the lady's name now, his landlady. He had to give his landlady the money. So he rejoiced. But then Dr. Hardy said, but look, he said, I can't give you the cash now. I've banked all my money. And Hudson Taylor cast down to the depths. And suddenly there was a knock on the door. And one of the wealthiest customers, not called customers, patients, came to the door, and he had a bill to pay, and it was there in cash, and he was able to pay. He went absolutely rejoicing in the Lord that night home and paid Mrs. whoever she was, the landlady, the money. So these lessons were incredibly important. Another thing which is very, very key is his view of the Bible as the written word of God. He was greatly influenced by a great Bible teacher with the brethren, in fact, the early brethren, called Andrew Jukes up there. I'm going to quote this. "It is well to remind ourselves of the close connection between the written word of God and the incarnate word of God. We shall never enjoy the one apart from the other. It is important we bear in mind that as the incarnate word is a divine person, so is the written word a divine message. To be unsettled on the question of the inspiration of Scripture is to be overcome by temptation and therefore unable to accomplish God's work." I would say to every one of us, that is extremely relevant today as it was back in 1850. By the way, he was greatly influenced at this time by stories of George Muller of Bristol. We haven't got time to go into that now. Some of you know that he's became a man who trusted God to supply the needs for literally hundreds and hundreds of orphans in Bristol without making appeals. By the way, another key issue was who he married. Hudson Taylor was a very, very affectionate man, all his life, most affectionate person. And he met this girl and he fell in love with her. She came from over the Humber in Barton-on-Humber. And he really loved her, but she had no call for China. And he went through agony over this. But in the end, God won through, and his calling to do God's work won through. So that was a big issue. It comes up later on. Financial principles. He deliberately lived frugally so he could give as generously as possible. And here is a very important issue. He decided he would never go into debt. And the reason is this. He said, if I go into debt, it means a failure to trust in the faithfulness of God. Very interesting. China and his call to China dominated his whole world in those days. So I hope you've got something from that, the foundations, the formative influence in his life, which actually never left him. He never deviated from these principles. Well, I've deliberately spent longer on that. And we now look at, at the China Hudson Taylor went to. Let's have a look at that. Now, there's a map of China. And what I've got down here is actually a disgrace in British history, the first Opium War, the second Opium War. Just to say very briefly, China was an ancient civilization. We should always remember that, much older civilization than ours. And there are many dynasties. The dynasty, by the way, the Qing dynasty, that means Qing, a dynasty in the Victorian century had become very, very weak. And in actual fact, there was a civil war going on. There was a rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion was going on. It was a full-scale civil war, actually, at the time. Now, in the middle of all that, you've got the colonial expansion of countries like Britain, France, and actually America was involved, and Portugal as well. And I think there were probably other countries as well. They were interested in trade in China. Things like tea and silk, of course, and I'm sure there are many other things as well. And what they did, Britain forced opium on China. The first Opium War, 1840-42, forced China against its will to allow the foreigners to have 5 treaty ports. There they are. You can see them on the right-hand side of the coast there. Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Xiamen, and Hong Kong, Macau. Macau is the Portuguese, Hong Kong, the British. Later on, there was a second Opium War, 59-60, and more treaty ports then were opened up. What this meant, by the way, a treaty port was this. It meant there was a small piece of ground that where foreigners could own land and build. And they used that as a trading base. So the Chinese would bring in all sorts of goods, and the foreigners would bring goods in from overseas, and they would exchanged, and there was trade going on there. Those were the treaty ports. Now, as far as missionaries were concerned, they were restricted to the treaty ports, and most of them remained in the treaty ports and just very, very nearby. The big exception, I've got to say, is the Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholics actually were in China much, much longer, and that's another story altogether. People like the Jesuits and so on were way inland much earlier. Okay, so that's something of the China that, and there's a disgrace in our own history there. It's one of the worst things I think the British ever did. By the way, I didn't explain this. The reason the British were pushing opium on to the Chinese is simply this. In North India, a lot of poppies were grown. There was a lot of opium, and Britain wanted a market for its opium. And opium was already known in China and used, but masses more was forcibly imported into China. Result, literally hundreds of thousands, probably millions of drug addicts as a result. It was a disgrace. Let's now look at Hudson Taylor and his trip to China. Hudson Taylor in China at 21. It's absolutely astonishing. I want at this point just to mention two really important books. I'm holding one up here, Hudson Taylor, In Early Years, The Growth of a Soul. This is written by his son and daughter-in-law, Dr. and Mrs. Howard Taylor. And the other one is a sequel to that and is this one here, Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission, The Growth of a Work of God. The reason I'm holding these up, I'm mostly quoting from these two books. And at the end, I'm going to read about 3 quotes from these books. They are absolute spiritual classics. I know of very few books that are better than these. If you want to know about how to walk with God and God at work in a life with all sorts of astonishing challenges in it, and see God answer prayer, read these books. They will inspire you. So Hudson Taylor in China, off we go. After quite a voyage of just over 5 months in a sailing boat, that's a story on its own. He arrives in Shanghai. What does he find? Shanghai, of course, is a treaty port. He finds actually there's a war raging at Shanghai. In Shanghai, you've got 2 parts. You've got the treaty port where the foreigners lived, and next to it, you've got the ancient walled city. Inside the ancient walled city, the rebels had established themselves, the triads. They come up, I think, from the south. And against them were the imperial forces with their cannons firing away. So it's a bit like in Mariupol tonight. The missionaries there, Hudson Taylor and the missionaries and everyone else living there went to bed at night with cannon fire all around them, often, not every night, but very often, and then musket fire, etc., etc., etc. So, number one, there's war raging in Shanghai. How on earth do you do missionary work trying to reach inland when there's a war going on? You can't. Secondly, he went out to China with an organization known as the China Evangelization Society. They turned out to be very zealous Christians, but with very little common sense when it came to running a mission the other side of the world. They had no money, they sent no money on for him, and arrived in Shanghai with some money in his pocket, no accommodation arranged, no money, and no money arrived for 3 months at least. It was actually extremely difficult and very embarrassing. Fortunately, there were some wonderful Christians there, some missionaries. They took him in and looked after him. They were outstanding people and became lifelong friends, numbers of them. Hudson Taylor also found huge prejudice against foreigners. They were called foreign devils. That happened all over China. There was huge prejudice against foreigners. To be fair, it's not surprising when you read some of the things that went on what was called gunboat diplomacy in those days. But in practice, of course, that meant, as I said just now, that missionary work was restricted largely to treaty ports, the 5 treaty ports in those days. So what I want to, yes, let's move to the next one, please. But nevertheless, this young man, full of zeal for the Lord, he devoted himself to learning Chinese, very difficult language. He employed teachers and so on and so forth. He didn't have a proper place to live. It wasn't easy. He moved from place to place a little bit, but he started evangelizing inland with 1 or 2 others from different missionary societies. And they started going inland. They were dressed as foreigners, and immediately they were set on by mobs of people who were more interested in their weird dress, these weird foreigners, than in the message they were trying to get across. But nevertheless, they did sell books, Christian books, testaments, and other Christian books in Chinese. He started doing medical work as well. And of course, there were so many injured people from the war, apart from anything else. He was often going into the Chinese town with the walled city, and doing medical work there. He later on made a huge and radical decision. He adopted Chinese dress and habits. This was absolutely outrageous in Victorian colonial times. We need to know that. In those days, and it seems incredible for me to say this, but Britain was more or less the top dog in the world in those days, with a large navy, colonies, new colonies developing in Africa, Asia, etc., etc. And the idea that British people should become like foreigners, well, they turned down, they looked down their noses at that sort of thing, to say the least. It was absolutely outrageous. And they said, they will cease to respect us as British people. That was the sort of general attitude. But what Hudson Taylor found is this. He found that the more he tried to adapt to Chinese ways, the closer he got to the people. And he made a radical decision. I've forgotten how long it took him. I think it took about 1.5 years, 2 years. And he thought, look, I'm going to try Chinese dress. Now, it didn't just mean Chinese dress. It meant shaving his head and having a pigtail. And Chinese shoes and everything like that. And do you know what he found? His friend was in foreign dress and he was in Chinese dress. No one took any notice of him. And he walked through the other guy was set on by a mob and so on and so forth. They're just fascinated and annoyed with this. But Hudson Taylor was left alone. They didn't realize he wasn't Chinese immediately. They used to sell books to reach the literati. There were very literate, intelligent people in China, very much so, very interested. They used to have public exams once a year all over China, the literati. And they used to cause a lot of trouble, by the way, as well. Now, we need to move on. Something happened. Hudson Taylor was desperate for a wife. When he left England, there was another hopeful young woman, and he kept writing to her and her father and hoping she'd come out of China, but it did not work. He moved from Shanghai to another treaty port called Ningbo. It's south of Shanghai, and it took several days to reach there. And there were a lovely lot of missionaries there. And one of them, a most incredible woman called Miss Aldersey, had 2 orphan girls, English girls. They'd been brought up in the Far East, I think in Malaysia they'd been brought up, but they were English girls. One was called Maria and the other was called Barella, her sister. And they were assisting Miss Aldersey in running a school for Chinese girls. And guess what? Hudson Taylor goes down to Ningbo. He's doing medical work, he's doing evangelism in the area, and he sets eyes on Maria. Now, unfortunately, these Victorian photographs don't do much, do they, for people? You know, she looks pretty severe there, as though you wouldn't cross her that much. She was actually a wonderful, wonderful young woman. She was, I think, 19 when they first set eyes on one another. It wasn't love at first sight because Miss Aldersey was in charge of Maria's welfare. Now, Miss Aldersey was an incredible woman. The Chinese were quite scared of her. One of the stories about Miss Aldersey was that the Chinese were all convinced that the governor, the number one British, I don't think he was called governor, sorry, it was a different name, but the number one British official took his orders from Miss Aldersey. She was an amazing woman. And she had very clear Victorian views about chaperoning young women. And it's quite a story, actually. There's a book written about it by J.C. Pollock, Hudson Taylor and Maria. But eventually, the course of true love found its way. And when she was 21, and I think a couple of days, she got married to Hudson Taylor. And it was a blissful marriage. They absolutely were a God-given couple for one another. She was a very godly woman. She was excellent at Chinese. She loved the Chinese. She was brilliantly fluent at Chinese language. She was an evangelist at heart. She was very clever. She was very gifted. And she was a wonderful, wonderful wife for him. I've forgotten how many children she bore. I think it was 6 or 7, actually, of which 2 died. At least 2 died. Okay, next one, please. Now, Hudson Taylor returned to England in 1860, in July 1860. He returned to England because he was in such an appalling state of health. In fact, as I've read a lot about Hudson Taylor's life, to me, is a miracle he lived beyond about 30. And as you know, he died at 73. He nearly died many times. And he returned to England with Maria and his small family. And he wrote to his mother, "The voyage may benefit me, that I may labor for China. If not, all is well. I am very happy in Jesus. Never felt him to be so precious a savior, lover, friend. Sometimes I think I shall not be spared to see you." He doubted if he'd be alive to see England again, but he was. He ended up back in England for 6 years at the time. And among other things, he was an advocate for missionary work in China. And through his inspiration, there were numbers of young men mainly who gave themselves for missionary work in all sorts of missionary societies. He didn't have a missionary society of his own, but gradually the conviction grew that he must found a mission society, which he was going to call the China Inland Mission. That grew, but so I would like to look now at his life's work, the China Inland Mission. I know I'm going to look at the principles it was based on. I just want to say a quick word about how it was formed. He knew there had to be a missionary society to reach inland China. The conviction absolutely grew, not just himself, but other people who were close to him, including a wealthy businessman known as William Berger. What happened was this, famously, in June 1865, he was down in Brighton. He wasn't feeling well. He wasn't in good health. He wasn't sleeping properly. He was greatly burdened for China. He had an enormous God-given burden for China. And he went to church on a Sunday morning in Brighton. It was packed out, about 1,500 people. It was Victorian England. There'd been a revival in 1859, and there was a great work of God going on in England, but it was so respectable and almost kind of smug, and he couldn't cope with it. And that Sunday morning, he left church and he walked down on the beach. He talks about the sands, but if you go to Brighton today, there's not only pebbles there. But anyway, that's a complete incident, not important thing. He walked on the beach, deeply, deeply burdened. He thought, look at these Christians. There are 1,500 of them. But in China, thousands and thousands are dying without Christ every day. What must be done for them? And there was a transaction, that's all you can say, between him and God at that point. And he suddenly realized, I can't do this work, but it's not my work, it's God's work. And I can do it under God. If it's God's work, it's God's responsibility. It's not my responsibility. It's God's responsibility. He's going to provide the money. He's going to provide the workers, and so on. And it went, and he walked back up the hill with a light heart. He went back to see his wife in London, and he was a transformed man. He knew what he had to do. So his life's work, the founding of the China Inland Mission. Now, what I'm going to talk about now are the principles of the China Inland Mission. And then, if I have to be briefly, we're going to look at the amazing achievements of the China Inland Mission. But I do think this is important and significant. It is founded on the principle of faith in God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It was founded on faith in God the Father to provide all the needs, including finances, including workers, including protection in a very dangerous country. And Hudson Taylor had many instances of direct answers to prayer. And I'm going to read this quote from Growth of a Work of God. The writer has seen God, in answer to prayer, quell the raging of the storm, alter the direction of the wind, and give rain in the midst of prolonged drought. He has seen him, in answer to prayer, stay the angry passions and murderous intentions of violent men and bring the machinations of his people's foes to naught. He has seen him, in answer to prayer, raise the dying from the bed of death when human aid was vain. He has seen him preserve from the pestilence that walks in darkness, that's in other words a pandemic, and from the destruction that wastes at noonday. He's quoting there from Psalm 91, I think. For more than 8 years and a half, he has proved the faithfulness of God in supplying his own temporal wants and the needs of the work in which he has been engaged. That's the first point. Faith in God the Father. Faith in God the Son. It was his work at his command. It's his kingdom, and therefore it must extend to all of China. So the greatest need for the workers, for him and every worker, is communion with God, to know his mind, to walk closely with him, to manifest Jesus to pagan Chinese and to skeptical Westerners. He has promised much fruit. Thirdly, God the Spirit, who empowers, gives endurance, joy, love, patience, kindness, etc. Jesus and all in him is mine, comes from a great Wesleyan hymn, mediated, of course, by the Spirit. The second here is to fully identify with the Chinese. By the way, this was a revolutionary principle at the time, both of these. Thirdly, respect for the leadership of Hudson, of many mistakes that the missionary society that sent him out, which by the way collapsed before he went back to China again. He knew mistakes that had been made there, and he acted to correct them. He'd become a godly leader by then, respect for his leadership in China. And another principle is never go into debt. I mentioned that earlier. Now, here's an interesting one. Also revolutionary at the time, women were to have an important role, reaching women, but actually it turned out that the Chinese men began to respect some of the women as well, very much, and asked them for advice. And later on, one of the features of the CIM, as it became known, China Inland Mission, was there were fields there were only women there, and they were greatly blessed of God. And at this point, I do want to say, did I say it earlier? I've forgotten. I don't think so. I've noticed that God gave Hudson Taylor remarkable women around him from the beginning of his life. His mother was a very wonderful, godly woman. And of course, she and her husband shaped the character of this young man. His sister was a remarkable woman, a teenager, 3 years younger than him, I think she was. Amelia was her name. He was so close to Amelia. You can't believe the letters they write. Don't think the Victorians were stuffy people. You just read the letters that were written. It's amazing. And then, of course, his first wife, Maria, most remarkable woman. And then his second wife, Jenny Faulding, she was outstanding, absolutely outstanding missionary, and a woman of remarkable faith herself. I'm going to read a quote just now from her. And lastly, all classes of people were to come as missionaries. That was revolutionary. See, missionaries went to China with people like the CMS, the Anglicans, and the congregations, the LMS. They were all college educated. They'd been to theological college. They came from a certain background, socially, etc., etc. Hudson Taylor said, no, all those called of God, even bricklayers, they were called masons in those days, they are welcome. So he had carpenters and bricklayers and farmers, and different people came out as missionaries. Okay, now we're not drawing to a complete close now, but I'm going to have to rush through this next bit. Okay, amazing achievements of the CIM. Now, in 1866, the mission was formed in June 1885. No, sorry, June 1865. A year later, in May 66, the Lammermuir party left England. There were 18 missionaries. It was the largest party of missionaries so far ever to leave the shores of Britain for China. And as he said, they were of all sorts of different backgrounds and classes. There's a picture, a very Victorian looking picture. Look at that guy in the middle there. There's a guy about 6'4". He's a Scotsman, a Highlander called George Duncan. He became a remarkable pioneer. There he is in the middle there, head and shoulders above everyone else, pretty much. There is the Lammermuir party, very much in English Victorian dress, of course, at the time. When they got over there, don't forget, this is the inland mission. They're not going to stick them in treaty ports. They had thrusts in two directions. Now, I can't point to this with the technology, but I think John, our technical guy, has got a little red doofer. There's a big river at the top of that map. This is, by the way, this map is of Shanghai and south of Shanghai, but there's a large river just north of Shanghai, and that, of course, is the famous Yangtze. That's it. You've got it, John, just there. So one of the thrusts is up the Yangtze Valley, and they aimed and achieved a settlement at a mission work based in Nanjing, which was an ancient capital of China. And even then it had 500,000 people in it. The other thrust, so that was one thrust up the Yangtze Valley. The other thrust was to the south. And you can see the name of a province there. When we're talking about China, by the way, that's the one there. Now it looks like Zhejiang. And I think, I'll bet there's a few people that know how to pronounce Chinese listening, but I think it's pronounced Zhejiang today. Now, that became a very important province for the CIM in the first thrust. And all I'm going to do is to give you one or two remarkable stories. The guy who settled Nanjing, there it is. I'm pointing my finger to my map. There it is, just on the extreme top left of the map, right at the top left, Nanking, it looks like, that's the one. The man who settled that was that indeed, that tall Scotsman, a tough guy, George Duncan, a hero of the early CIM. He walked, I think it was 150 miles at least to reach there. He traveled a long way. He settled in. He was chucked out. They tried to get rid of him, but he found a place he could. No one would allow him a room to stay. No one would rent him property at all. It was a story repeated again and again in China. No one would help him, and he ended up sleeping in, I think it was a tower of a Buddhist temple, actually. But he established a work there in Nanjing. But another story is of another Scotsman right down at the bottom of the map in the middle. There's a place called Wenzhou there, right down the bottom there. That's it, John, you've got it. Wenzhou. Now, the man who established the work there was a remarkable Scot called George Stott. He had one leg, and when he lost it in an accident, some industrial accident, and when Hudson Taylor interviewed him in Britain, he looked at him and said, look, I don't think there's a place for disabled people on the mission field. And George Stott retorted, he said from Isaiah, the lame shall take the prey, he said. Hudson Taylor said, there's a man for China. And sure enough, he went down to Wenzhou and he established the work there. They tried to get rid of him in the normal way, but he stuck it. And I don't know if any of you know this, I think some of you will. Wenzhou in the 21st century, late 20th, 21st century, is known as the Jerusalem of China. It is a remarkable Christian center. They've sent missionaries from Wenzhou all over China. I'm talking about in the communist era now. By the way, the Chinese government, the Communist Party, have knocked down some of the big churches. They're so big, with a big cross on top, they wanted to get rid of them. They look too prominent. But that work was begun by a disabled missionary from Scotland. Wonderful. Now, many advances were made up the Yangtze Valley, down in Zhejiang, but at enormous cost. First of all, there was sickness and death. Hudson Taylor buried 2 children at this time. Maria died at 33 of tuberculosis. Others were invalided home, including George Duncan. In his 30s, he was invalided home, as was someone else. There were at least 2 or 3 invalided home, and they died in their early 30s back in Britain. Enormous cost. Now, sadly, the second we've also got to record. And the devil does this again and again in the work of the kingdom of God. There was a rebellious spirit within the first missionary group. There were some who objected to dressing as Chinese and having Chinese habits and stuff like that. And there was a rebellion against Hudson Taylor's leadership. We need to know Hudson Taylor was not a difficult person. He was not a difficult person. Some missionary leaders have been difficult persons. If you've ever read the life of C.T. Studd, you'll know that some missionary leaders were not easy people always. But Hudson Taylor was a gracious, kind, patient, loving man, very firm, very clear, but he was not a difficult person, and yet his leadership was challenged. In the end, they had to get rid of one missionary, actually, and what shook the rest, the rebellious group, is one of them died, and that really shook them and brought them to repentance. And lastly, there were riots. And I think now we're going to, yes, here we are. This is a drawing of a terrible riot and an infamous riot at a place called Yangzhou, which is on the Yangtze River north of Shanghai. Is part of the Yangtze Thrust. And they were warned, don't go to Yangzhou. It's a terrible place. The people there will attack you. They are notorious people in Yangzhou. But with great courage, the CIM missionaries went there. And it's a long story, and it's incredible. The house that they rented, which was a series of properties around a courtyard, actually, so there are a number of missionaries there, and Chinese as well, was surrounded by 10,000 people at least. Hudson Taylor managed to slip out and go and see the local Mandarin, who actually didn't even see him. He kept him waiting for, I think, 45 minutes to an hour. Eventually, I mean, everyone could hear the riot going on. And eventually, Hudson Taylor remonstrated with him, look, this is you're responsible for law and order in your town and stuff like that. Obviously, he spoke completely fluent Chinese by then. And eventually things were sorted out, but there were terrible scenes. And there were a number of heroes of this. They had to jump from the first floor, and there's a picture of a lady jumping from the first floor, and she was caught by a missionary there, a man, a British guy, forgotten his name now. And in fact, they were throwing stones. He lost an eye in the riot. There's another missionary on the floor there, Emily Blatchley, her name was. She fell on her back and got seriously injured. Someone else had their arm shattered, but no one died. It is extraordinary when you read the details of that. But sadly, the British authorities, what happened is news of this riot in a few days' time reached Shanghai, and it was in the press there, and it went back to Britain. And in actual fact, much against what Hudson Taylor wanted, there were debates in the House of Lords about it. It was known in Britain, and it was publicized widely in Britain, and the CIM were given a bad name. What are they doing? You know, among these terrible Chinese, blah, 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 blah. You can imagine it. So the courage and perseverance was astonishing. And then just one other thing quickly, the vision of Hudson Taylor was always to go to the 9 provinces. I think we're looking at the next one now, advance to the 9 provinces. Here we are, amazing achievements of the CIM, advanced into 9 provinces. On the map there, you've got in white the ones that were nearer the coast that had been reached by the mid-1860s by various missionary societies and the CIM. We're looking up to about 1870 now, but there was the huge challenge of the other unreached provinces, and they're all there, they're named there. You're talking about an enormous country, by the way. We need to remember that. And this was the era of, frankly, incredible heroes of the faith. And 2 of them are there, a man called George Easton and a man called James Cameron, another Scot. Cameron became known as the Livingstone of China, because just like Livingstone walked from one side of Africa to another, at least twice, and all over Africa, so James Cameron walked from actually the far west, if you can put a little red thing there, the edge of Sichuan and Yunnan, where you can see it, there right across to the coast. Now, these were not just walks. He was always with a Chinese evangelist, and wherever they went, they sought opportunities to preach. They always preached the gospel wherever they went, whatever town or village, opportunities. They sold New Testaments and Christian books, and they were also in every province looking for place or places to become permanent centers for church planting. I haven't got time to go into any more than that. Yes, I haven't. I've overshot my time, but I've got to tell you, in conclusion, some outstanding lessons from Hudson Taylor's life. Forgive me for being a little long tonight, but we are dealing with a very outstanding man, and probably a man talking, you can talk too much. First of all, of course, faith in God. Hudson Taylor's whole life and work for God was in order to demonstrate three fundamental truths. First of all, there is a God. Secondly, he has spoken to us through the Bible. And thirdly, he means what he says. He learned early on, as we've seen, to trust God for all supplies, depend on it. God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. Famous words of Hudson Taylor. Hudson Taylor learned through many, many crises. We've hardly touched on the crisis. He was constantly dealing with crises. When you think the number of missionaries just grew exponentially, and he ended up, by the time he died, with hundreds and hundreds of missionaries in China, obviously there were many, many problems from all sorts of directions. Hudson Taylor came to know God, to walk with him, and to roll all his problems and burdens onto God. And I do want to read this to you. Hudson Taylor had received letters. He got a bunch of letters arriving on one occasion, as Mr. Nicol relates. Mr. Nicol was again one of these great pioneers, George Nicol. He brought news of serious rioting in 2 different stations. In other words, people's lives were in danger. Standing at his desk to read them, Mr. Taylor mentioned what was happening and that immediate help was necessary. Feeling that he might wish to be alone, the younger man was about to withdraw when, to his surprise, someone began to whistle. It was the soft refrain or chorus of the well-known and well-loved hymn, Jesus, I am resting in the joy of what thou art. Turning back, Mr. Nicol could not help exclaiming, how can you whistle when our friends are in such danger? Would you have me anxious and troubled? Was the long-remembered answer. That would not help them and would certainly incapacitate me for my work. I have just to roll the burden on the Lord. Day and night, that was his secret, just to roll the burden on the Lord. Frequently, those were wakeful in the little house at Xinjiang might hear at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning the soft refrain of Mr. Taylor's favorite hymn. I think that's highly significant and important for all of us. Faith in God means you cast your care on him. Secondly, spiritual warfare. I think personally there's so much to learn from this man of God, whose whole life's work was spent assaulting the devil's strongholds. So here are some of the key points. There's a phrase of his, we cannot expect lightly, now this is Victorian English, okay, we cannot expect lightly to assault Satan's domain. If we do, we will be corrected. In other words, we'll get a mighty kick up the pants. The whole of his work was a battle with the powers of darkness, how to overcome. First of all, total dedication. Here's another saying. The real secret of an unsatisfied life lies too often in an unsurrendered will. They would often, by the way, once a year, they would have gatherings. And when Hudson Taylor, obviously his work his role as the work progressed was to move around from different parts of China to encourage the work. When he came, there'd be a gathering of missionaries. And this would be the emphasis, walking with God, total surrender to the Lord. The other thing I think about spiritual warfare is prayer and fasting. Which I think is the next phrase, prayer and fasting. At crucial times, God gave wonderful manifestations of his presence. I must read another example of this. here now. Hudson Taylor, it is our Father who orders all, these experiences included. I feel more, and he's talking about, of course, crises, difficulties. I feel more and more that it is with him we have to do, not so much with men or things, but with him. And herein lies our power to do and suffer patiently, perseveringly. We can take rebuffs, sorrows, disappointments from his hand, though we might resent them from one another, and joys are doubly joys when received from him. You've got the spirit of this man, and I do want to read one more, forgive me. Here's one here. This is from his wife. This is from Jenny, his second wife. She's writing this. I have been spreading before the Lord, she had written soon after reaching Shanghai, some of the numerous difficulties that await you, and thinking of them with something of rejoicing. What a woman she was. What a platform there will be for our God to work and triumph on, and how clearly we shall see his hand. May he keep you without care, without worries, and bring you up like Jehoshaphat, your mouth filled with songs of praise in prospect of certain victories. Oh, the resources of the grace you have to draw upon, according to his riches in glory, according to your need, surely to need much grace, and therefore to have much given is not a thing to be troubled about, is it? No wonder God blessed these amazing people. I've just got to lastly say, the secret of his fruitfulness was his understanding of John 15, the vine and the branches, learning to rest in Christ. That's his family, as far as I know. In the middle, of course, is Hudson Taylor. This is, I think, in his 60s. The lady to our left, his right, is Jenny, his second wife. The two men, looking pretty severe with the moustaches, are his two sons, Howard and Herbert. And I think the other two must be his daughters and, of course, the grandchildren as well. So we close with that. I've rambled a bit, but I hope not too much. So, Andrea, it's over to you. And if anyone's got any questions, I will attempt to answer them.
Yeah, thanks, John. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I scribbled so much in my notebook. So yes, this is question and answer time. We've already got a few in the chat, but if anyone listening has any questions that they want to ask John, feel free to just put them in the chat. So we'll start off with a question that's come in from Derek, and he says, how did Hudson Taylor and CIM develop local converts to build and extend the church kingdom? How soon did the Chinese become responsible?
No, thank you, Derek, for that. The answer is actually very soon. Let me just give you one example. From Hudson Taylor's first spell in China, which was, I think, 6 or 7 years, and he got married, of course, in that time. He came back, it was 6 years. He came back in 1860. During that time, there were some wonderful conversions in Ningbo where they were based. One of them was a basket maker called Nangui. Forgive my total English pronunciation of the Chinese. And he just grew and grew, and he just kind of devoured the teaching that Hudson Taylor was giving in the little church there in Ningbo. And one of the things he was asked to do once was to make a basket to offer incense to an idol, and he refused to do so. And during that business transaction or refusal to do business, there was a man called Wang Jai Wang something, who heard. And Wang was so deeply impressed. He thought, what, a religion where the man refuses money for his business because he believes. And he became very interested. He actually, Wang Dai Jun, something like that, he became one of the pillars of the church. And early on, in another city called Hangzhou, which is a very big city, all these cities now with millions and millions of people in them now, of course, he became the first pastor of the church in Hangzhou, and he became almost an apostolic figure, you know, in the church planting ministry. So actually, the answer to that question is early on, Chinese got involved, but there were disappointments, as often happens. And I do need to just give another example. Some of you may have know this if you've read about China. In the 1880s, there was an outstanding conversion in the northwest of China, in Shaanxi province. And this man had been an opium addict, but he was a very intelligent, one of the literati. He was one of these very educated people. And the man who led him to the Lord was a Methodist missionary called David Hill. And very cleverly, he realized, look, to reach the literati, you've got to use their gifts. And he therefore set him some kind of competition, or he set the literati some kind of competition. And this man, whose name was C, HSI in English, C Teng Mo or something or other, he got converted. He got very, very interested, and he came to Christ. Now, he became a remarkable and very strong leader. Not all the missionaries could cope with him, frankly, but he became, and when Hudson Taylor met him, he recognized this is the type of Chinese leader we've been praying for. A strong leader, really able by his life to be an example, but he's able to stand up to the pressures as well, and who understands the gospel. So the answer is, as soon as possible, Chinese leaders were raised up and given responsibility. I've rambled a bit, Derek, but I hope that's some kind of answer there. I can see my friend Pete Hill up there, and I don't know whether Pete knows anything about this. He may well do. If so, if you've got something to add, Pete, or anyone else, please feel free to do so. Another question, Andrea.
Yes, we've got another question in the chat from Clive. He says, can you say something about the specific targets? And it's just disappeared from my screen. So can you say something about the specific targets he set in prayer for missionaries to be raised up for the mission?
Right. There were a number, actually. Initially, he had 9 provinces, you know, the 9 unreached provinces. He prayed for 2 missionaries for each province. So he prayed for 18. And God gave the 18. It's actually, I mean, it's a terrific story. I mean, I've got 6 volumes here on Hudson Taylor, actually written by A.J. Broomhall, and it's absolutely thrilling to read it all. But later on, not Hudson Taylor, but someone else, the first deputy director of the mission was a man called Stevenson. I'm not sure if he was Scottish either. I can't quite remember. But this man, George Stevenson, I think it was him. He felt convinced that we must pray for 100 new workers. That was around about 1880s, I think. Now, Hudson Taylor was a bit taken aback. And they had a special time of prayer, fasting, seeking God. And at the end of it, Hudson Taylor was so convinced. He said, I'm as convinced that God is going to give them as if they were all lined up now in China already. And God gave the 100. Later on, actually, it's quite a story. I didn't have time to give it, but God raised up some very influential people, and some of them were famous people actually, who were part of that large group that came out, the 100. And among them were the famous group called the Cambridge Seven. Among them was C.T. Studd, who was one of the best cricketers in England. He actually played in the Ashes Test, the original Ashes Test, where the wickets were burnt. And he was probably, if not the best, one of the best batsmen in England at the time. So he was famous, as were others that came out at that time. So specific targets, there was the 18, there was the 70, and there was the 100. And God answered those prayers, everyone. I hope I've answered that, John.
Wow. So pray specifically is the is the takeaway from that then.
But I think the thing, Andrea, I think, they had to be convinced it was God's will. It wasn't just a bright idea. They really sought God to know the will of God. I think that's really, really important. I think for all of us, isn't it, in our Christian walk, we do need to see God answering our prayers. And sometimes he answers them quickly, but very often I found it takes a long while. We have to persevere in prayer. Now, are there any more comments or questions, I wonder?
Yes, they're coming in a steady stream on the chat. So
Great.
John has said, do you know how much Hudson Taylor's legacy is recognized in the modern Chinese church today?
Now, that's a really good question. I'm just going to give an anecdotal example of that, okay? A friend of mine has been a Pentecostal missionary in Hong Kong since 1974, 75. His name is Paul Waller, actually. Now, Paul Waller comes from Barnsley in Yorkshire, okay? He goes out to Hong Kong in the mid-70s. And he started ministry he started learning Cantonese and started going over the border into China. When the Chinese found he was from Barnsley, immediately, some of them, the older ones, they immediately said, Hudson Taylor, he was from Barnsley. They knew him. And I have heard that there are Chinese tourists who are Christians who've gone to Barnsley looking for Cheapside, which is the name of the street where the chemist shop was, where James Taylor, which was the name of Hudson Taylor's father, where his chemist shop was. So I can't say up to date in the 21st century, because of course we're getting further away from the time, but I know towards the end of the 20th century, the older Chinese Christians knew about Hudson Taylor and revered him, because Hudson Taylor loved China and the Chinese. And he did so much to lay the foundation of the work of God in that place. It is significant, of course, you probably know this if you read about China, that the strong churches of China tend to be on the East Coast. And Wenzhou is one example that I mentioned, but there are other strong churches down the East Coast, which is where the missionary work was established longest. Okay, Andrea.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, John. We've got another one. This one's come in anonymously, and it says, I've recently read Growth of the Soul, and this person agrees that it's an inspirational book. How can we do more to encourage young people in our churches to take an active interest in overseas mission?
Now, what a question. And I don't think I'm just one voice on this. And there may be others who would like to chime in on this, to be honest, because I think it's a very important question. Here's my comment. The Church of Jesus Christ in many parts of the world has been established. Some of you know that my wife and I spent 24 years in Africa, mainly in Zambia. Now, there is a church in Africa in many parts of it, but there are parts of the world where there is not really a strong established church, namely the Muslim world. But of course, the Muslim world, you can't just go there as a missionary. You go as something else if you can go at all. Now, my observation in the modern world is there's great enthusiasm to do short-term work. of various sorts. Could be evangelism, because English, of course, universal language, but it could be projects like building a building and stuff like that. But those are short term. There is still a need for long-term missionaries. This week, actually, on Monday, I was talking to the leader from a big missionary society for 6 Central Asian countries. And she's a lady, and I was asking her about the missionary force, and there are a lot of missionaries there, very few from Britain, mostly from Korea, Mexico. There was one Turkish guy, there was a British guy, an American guy, Swiss, but mostly from Korea, Mexico, I think maybe Argentina as well. So we need to remember that God has raised up missionaries from his church around the world. Now, I'm rambling, aren't I? Because the question is, I'd make a good politician at this point, wouldn't I? Missing the question. The question is how to interest our. I honestly think you've got to give information. And obviously, those books are of a complete previous generation. To my mind, they're gold, but we do need up-to-date information. And I would recommend, for interest and prayer, Operation World. It's written by a friend of mine, Patrick Johnson. We were together in the Dorothea Mission in Southern Africa. But that is an excellent and very, very well-researched resource on countries around the world. But also, you can get information from all sorts of sources. Obviously, very popular these days is the persecuted church, and it's very, very important that support is given to the persecuted church. But I'm wondering if someone else has got something to say. I don't know how we do this. People put their hands up, and our tech guy can let them in, because I'm sure, Andrea, there might be one or two others who might like to contribute. How can the younger generation get involved and interested in mission work overseas? I've given a few little things there. Operation World, get information, read older books to get inspired.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone has any thoughts, do pop it in the chat or pop your hand up, and our tech team will unmute you.
There we are, my friend Pete Hill up there, up in Derby. You're on, Pete.
Yeah, hi, John. Yes, thanks. Yeah, it was actually me who asked the question. So but
oh, really?
I mean, I think doing things like you're doing on this these 3 weeks. We couldn't join you last week, I'm afraid, but I think it's a brilliant. And I hope there are amongst those who are listening. I hope there are some of the young people.
There are from our church, I know.
Great. Yeah. But it's difficult, isn't it, to encourage young people really to be thinking. I was thinking of Hudson Taylor being such a young man, and I wonder if there are still within Christian unions at university groups like we were fortunate to have at Southampton that encouraged us, you and me and others, to be involved.
Yeah, that's another thing, isn't it? Next week, by the way, the speaker, Nay Dawson, works for IFES, which is the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. And, one could ask her something on this. She will be aware, Europe-wide, as well as in this country, of any interest in serving the Lord. I'm sure she'll know a lot about it, actually. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? We've still got a few minutes left, I think. Yeah. Andrea, any more?
Yes, one's just coming from Yolanda, who said, are there any links between Hudson and Gladys Aylward, probably butchered that, sorry, besides both working for God in China?
I honestly am awfully sorry, Yolanda. I cannot answer that one. I don't know. of any links, but there may have been. I don't know the dates that Gladys Aylward went to China, but I think it was in the 20th century. And Hudson Taylor personally, of course, died as an old man in 1905. I doubt somehow whether there were personal links, but I would be very surprised if she didn't know and have links with CIM missionaries. I don't know if anyone could answer that. I can't answer that. I'm awfully sorry. Yes, I think Chris Hill can answer.
My mother had a very good friend who was a CIM missionary in China, and she had met Gladys Aylward. So obviously Gladys had some knowledge of CIM missionaries.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
I'm awfully sorry. I think that's the most helpful answer, what Chris has just given. You know, there were links for CIM missionaries, but I doubt it with Hudson Taylor. I'm sure he died by then.
Brilliant. Thanks, John.
Okay.
And Sheena's put a comment in the chat, just an observation, I think, saying, get the young people interested in sharing the gospel in this country, let alone abroad, which is, of course, very important.
Actually, I'm just thinking, you know, we're such a multicultural society, aren't we? You know, I mean, you know, folks here from Gloucester, folks here from Derby, we're from Southampton here, and there may be from other towns. Yes, there is. There's West Midlands, someone from the West Midlands. Frankly, we've got opportunities to do cross-cultural mission in our bigger cities, haven't we? That's a good start. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one more comment on this topic about inspiring young people, which has obviously caught some attention this evening. Clive just says short-term mission trips with organisations like OM can inspire a longer-term interest. It happened to me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. That's very helpful. The organisations like OM, YWAM, and there will be others as well, I believe. That is very, very important indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And in our church, we had a young lady of Punjabi origin, British Punjabi origin, who spent 2 years on the Logos Hope in Latin America. And it was very, very important in her experience, very important indeed. Is there any more at all?
This is the last call for questions. If anyone's got any others, pop them in the chat now. That was our last one, so we'll be wrapping up. I just do want to say a really big thank you to you, John. That was absolutely fascinating, and for everyone who asked questions and joined in with the discussion at the end as well. That was really good. It has been recorded and it will be on YouTube if you want to go back and listen again and get more of the nuggets of wisdom that John has shared with us this evening. And if you are available next Thursday evening, we'll be doing this all again. As John mentioned, Nay's going to be leading, and she's going to be taking us through the life of Amy Carmichael, which I'm sure is going to be absolutely amazing as well. So again, thank you to you, John. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up tonight?
My wife has cautioned me. I'd just like to say, Amy Carmichael, immensely important, and made such an impact. 56 years in India, she never came back to Britain, and a very, very outstanding, very godly, and very courageous person in the far south of India, a place called Donagur. And my friends up there, Pete and Chris Hill, actually will know about it because I'm sure they've probably been there because they served the Lord in South India themselves for many years. Yeah.
Fantastic. If that doesn't make you want to come and join us next Thursday, I don't know what will. So thank you all very much for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and the rest of your week, and hopefully we will see you next Thursday. So take care, everyone.
God bless everybody.